Good afternoon, and it's a great honor to be here and talk about family firms, not only in this place, but also invited by these organizations. I am going to talk about family firms as responsible businesses and families in businesses as responsible capitalists. Now, since it's after lunch, and you all have a good lunch here, at least I thought I could have a slightly more colorful slides that I brought here so we don't fall too much asleep. So, we already saw this many times today. The world has challenges, and I'm not going to dwell into that too much. We have great global challenges on the climate. We have great global challenges on inequality. And the question I am going to talk about, and this session is going to talk about, is the family firm in a situation where they have a special position to engage in and find solution to these global challenges. Now, I'm going to do it in a more positive way. I'm going to share some of my experience with teaching global family businesses around the world, in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America. And I'm going to share you some of the pros and cons I find in the family business model as a provider of good, if we may say that. But before we dig into that, we have to talk a little bit about what we are talking about. Now, one of the challenges with family firms is that we all have some particular example, some particular picture in our mind when we hear the word family businesses, and it really covers an incredible range of business organizations. In the most broadest terms, it is the most typical business organization in the world. It dominates the private held companies in all countries, maybe except mainland China. It is among the largest companies, still a very dominating factor. In Asia, almost all the good business groups, big business groups, are family businesses. In Europe, it's around 40%, and in the US, it's still around 1/3 of the largest firms, which we will denote by some definition as family firms. So there's no doubt about the family business structure. One is the most typical organizational structure in the world, and two, it's really a broad set of businesses, and they have very different properties depending on if it's, of course, a small village firm in Africa or it's one of the biggest listed companies in the US. So it's really, really hard to say family firms is one thing. Now, what I will do is, when I speak and integrate with family businesses, many family firms have a clear view that the business structure of a family firm is specially catered towards challenging some of the global problems, towards being responsible capitalists. And there are three main arguments that comes up all the time. One, they think longer, they have long horizon. Two, they are often having a business model which is based on values and culture. And three, in my formulation, they're rich, so they do a lot of good work on the philanthropy. And what I want to do the next 15 minutes is to set the table for the further discussion by evaluating each of these arguments. So, the first argument is really that family firms have a longer horizon. They think in generation, and as Andrea Hoffman from La Roche, for instance, says, it's very hard to think about giving your business to your kids or to your grandchildren without thinking about what is the world that comes with that businesses. You know, you may give your grandchildren a lot of money, but if you together have destroyed the world to get that money, it really doesn't fit into the mind. And it's true. It's true that some family firms have a very long perspective. Here's my favorite family firm, And I don't know how many of you who have met this firm before, but this is actually the world's oldest business, period. It was founded, and we know that because the guy up here, does this work, is Prince Shotoku in Japan. He was the one who made Japan Buddhist. And he did that. He was born in 572, and he decided when he was 4 years old that Japan should be a Buddhist country, but they didn't have any Buddhist temples. So they invited 3 carpenters from Korea, and these 3 carpenters built Shinten-ji, which is still there today, and they still claim that part of this tower is built in 576. Now, one of these 3 carpenters died, and his 2 sons were basically put in to maintain the Shinten-ji temple ever since. And they did that for 41 generations and built a lot of other beautiful Buddhist temples. This became Kongo Gumi, which is a construction company, which in 2008 still had a revenue of around $100 million and were basically specialists in Buddhist temples. It's also true, and this is the sad part of the story, that the 41 generation went to and got an MBA from an American university, business school, and basically drove the company into bankruptcy. So the company went bankrupt in 2010, and is today just an independent division of another construction company. But that is the oldest company in the world. And if you run a firm which has 40 generations, I know some Italian firms are very old, 5, 6 generations. Actually, I think you have one of Europe's oldest, this glass company, also one of the oldest companies in Europe, but it's not as long as that. If you run your family businesses for 10 generations, for 20 generations, for 40 generations, then of course you have to think about the world, right? I mean, then, you know, long-term perspective give you some perspective. I don't even know what profit means, except from you can go bankrupt if you don't have it. But, you know, think about what is profit when you think about 1,000 years old firms. So I agree with that. I agree with that many family firms are long-term perspective. And with long-term perspective comes things like loyalty. And you do see many really good family businesses who are very loyal towards products, towards employees, towards the local communities all around the world, and sometimes to entire countries. So the loyalty is part of a family business, and when it works, it's also part of being responsible owners. I had the privilege of working with World Economic Forum, and we developed this kind of long-term planning model. And I think one of the things to take out of that is that there are dimensions in long-term planning when you have family firms which goes beyond the traditional long-term planning for non-family firms. And these are issues like, of course, transition through the generations. These are issues like family governance and also ownership, because I think family firms do question the type of ownership regularly. Not least because they have to give ownership through the generations, and there's this natural diffusion of ownership if you don't do anything across generations. You know, the biggest family having a firm today, I think, is actually not the biggest, but the biggest we know about is the Solvay family, the Solvay group. I think they have 2,400 known family members owning the company, plus all those they are not aware of. I'm told that there's an Indian company which have even more family owners. Now, all that is good, and all that may make you more responsible as capitalism. But, and here comes the backside, and this would be kind of the talk, that there's a flip side of most of the argument. Some families should stop being family firms. The problem with the family business model when you have this long-term vision is that you often also have a business model which has less checks and balances and which has less people who can say no to charismatic leaders. And I'm not discussing any particular cases here, but I think a lot of us, as Marco also said, 20 years ago, we had a lot of corporate scandals in Europe and the US and other places. And a lot of these corporate scandals were about prominent family businesses where there were no checks and balances, and you had very charismatic business people who were not checked in any ways and ran it all down at some point. So that's the first argument, the long-termism. The second argument that family firms often provide, there's one more argument, of course, which we also mentioned briefly before, that in the long-term vision comes often an element of entitlement to succession. And succession is one of the things we have researched most on in family firms. And it is not clear that, let me put it a different way, succession is not something that should be institutionalized. Succession is something which should be based on merit. We would always say that, family business would always say that. But still, some successions should probably never have happened. We can use many words for that. In the finance research, we often tend to be a little more brutal and call it the idiot son problems. Now, it was also mentioned this morning, what is the solution? Patagonia this morning actually came out, and it's not because they don't have family heirs, but they have put the company into a foundation instead of doing a family succession. And that is one of the solutions family firms do when they want to institutionalize the ownership of the family, even in a situation where the family is not active in the management. That raises then other challenges, but that's not the topic of today, of my part of today. So, the second thing that we hear family firms talking about is that family leadership is value-based. And when you are value-based leaders, your personal values impact the culture of the firm, and we already agreed on that culture is such an important thing, but it also can be aligned with having a purpose and having a greater ambition than just making profit. Now again, there are great examples of this, and I couldn't hesitate here to give me my other favorite family firms, at least until 2010. As you may know, the Cadbury Chocolate Company is a Quaker company. They have a great history in Quakerism, and Quakers were extremely value-based. They are very social-minded religion, and the only reason to do business, and this was Birmingham, 1830s, this was Dickens, England, where the kids were up in the chimneys and the men were drinking and everything was really, really bad. And the Quakers saw business as part of a social endeavor, a part of a way to get the kids out of the chimneys and the men stopped drinking. And Cadbury was all about that. That also meant that they were awful at doing business the first 30, 40 years. But in the long run, they did extremely well and became the biggest chocolate company in the world. The moment they became big, they built this, which is called the Factory in the Garden in Bournemouth, and that is today a museum. But the moment they had money, they moved out of the inner city and built houses for their employees, built schools, built recreative facilities, simply because the business was to improve the life of the employees. They were the first one to have sick leaves. They were the first one to do a lot of what we today call CSR, but they did it in around 1900 or 1880s. So they were really prominent in this. And of course, we also know Cadbury for something else. Because they were such a value-based company, Adrian Cadbury became the first chairman of the Corporate Governance Code in England, the so-called Cadbury Commission and the Cadbury Report, which has inspired all corporate governance in the world. And we interviewed Adrian for this. I had the privilege to write a case with one of the Cadbury members, and he said basically that when he wrote the code, this was just Quaker values, but he knew that he couldn't get the impact in the work if he said, good corporate governance is Quaker values. But things like honesty, trust, and everything comes directly from there, in his view, from the values of the Quakers. So again, we see many companies and family businesses which are value-based, and we've done some research on this. We have asked 1,500 CEOs about their values, and it turns out that if we talk about values like honesty, altruism, trust, political interest even, family firms seem to be managed by CEOs which are more value-based, and it's a more important part of the business structure. Now, what is the problem? Of course, not all values are good. And I think recently we have seen families in businesses who have had values that are not consistent with saving the world, to say it least. We all know another prominent case from the US where basically a family made their entire wealth on selling Oxycontin, a painkiller which helped people not having pain, but it also basically created the opioid crisis in the US, and the family made basically a lot of money of making people drug addicts. Now, this family has also used the money in a very, very progressive way. The philanthropic part of the family wealth has been fantastic. But that doesn't help when the money is created on destroying the world or the people in the world. So one of the big things, I think, when we talk about family firms is you have to be accountable for the way money is generated. It's not enough to talk about the way families and business spend their wealth. It's really the accountability of how the money is earned, which I think we can learn from this super interesting case. By the way, here's basically a similar case in Asia. The Bagri Group, which is one of the dominating post-Suharto families in Indonesia, they made basically the biggest environmental catastrophe we have seen ever. And this picture over here, this is an explosion in a lake, which basically is the biggest poison. This is the real picture of the explosion, and it basically poisoned the whole area. I'm not quite sure how this picture got so red, but it doesn't look too good, that red color. And it killed thousands of people, and there were court cases for many, many years, and to my knowledge, the Bagri Group has never really paid any serious damage for this. So, again, it's true that the best family firms are value-based. The best family firms have very strong purpose, culture, as we talked about this morning, but not all family firms have that. And again, when there's no checks and balances, you can come away with a lot. The final argument I want to talk about is about the wealth, because the third thing that families often present is a fantastic philanthropic work. And I would not underestimate that. Many, many things are supported by business families or rich families, which tend to be business families. The Gates Foundation is a prime example, which has an ambition of destroying or of deleting cola from the world. The World Wildlife Foundation was basically made by the Hoffman funds. Any university we work in have donations from business families, culture, even the Chinese Wall. I was giving a talk in China and we went to the Chinese Wall, and it seemed to be restored by Merck, the big European medical company. So philanthropy is obviously a source of responsible capitalism for the business families. And with that comes what we will talk more about and talked a little bit about before, and I think the day tomorrow will always also be about that impact investment. Many families are leading impact investors, not least because the next generation who is going to inherit the wage love impact investment, and there are whole associations of that, Ahsoka and these kind of things. And we shouldn't underestimate also that many things are inherited, and entrepreneurial drive is inherited, like, law professors kids become law professors, and entrepreneurs' kids become very good entrepreneurs. And teaching at Insead and teaching MBAs for many years, there are a lot of fantastic, progressive next gens coming out of the family firms that really wants to do business in the right way. However, I think there's a general challenge of business being very strong and business being able to move around in the world, both to optimize business and to minimize taxes, and individuals nowadays also to move around And it raises some of the questions around the family firm model also. So one is that over time we have had all these leaks. And one of the, for me, reading many of these leaks, one of the things that surprised me were some of the family business names that showed up in the leaks. Clearly, some family firms have a problem paying taxes, and some families in business in the countries where they belong to. Now they can move the business, or they can do all other kind of aggressive tax behavior. But it is a big challenge. How do societies finance when people and individuals and firms are so movable as they are today? Now, when that is said, maybe the problem is not family firms here, because I helped both the Danish and the Swedish government with some tax structures. And if we look at the corporations who pay taxes, and I'm sure that must be the same in Italy, it's actually the family firms who pay taxes. You know, those who don't pay taxes at all, at least in Scandinavia and probably also in Italy, are Google and Facebook and these extremely international companies, because they have a very professional way to optimize their tax payments. So I don't want to be too hard on family firms on this, because family firms actually are, part of their loyalty is that when they pay taxes, they do it in their home countries. But there's another challenge I want to raise at the end here, and then I'm done. And that is kind of the weak societies and strong business issue we have nowadays. And I have one favorite picture to kick this discussion off with. This is a wonderful picture. If you don't know these guys, they are the family chairmen of the chaebols in Korea. So this is Mr. Hyundai, this is Mr. Samsung, third generation, who actually is going a little bit in and out of jail. Many of these are going in and out of tax jails, by the way. These are the 16 chaebols family chairmen. And they were invited into the parliament one day to discuss kind of the power and the society and the influence. This was under the corruption, among other things. If you remember, his family was supporting a religious figure who was supporting the president. There was a big case. And they had, you know, these things going on a lot in Korea about how do the society function when you get business, and in this case, 16 family businesses who are so powerful that they basically can set the rules themselves. And how do weak government and weak societies make rules? I mean, in the ideal world, we all know from Friedman, you know, that if the governments were super strong, the governments could just make the perfect rules, right? And then business could do whatever they wanted inside these rules. But that's not the case today. I mean, these 16 chaebols are so extremely economic powerful. It's probably the most extreme example you can have Korea today, because there are no middle firms in Korea. There are only chaebols or very small firms. So they have, of course, a huge power. But at least when the president calls them, they still come in and make the oath and sit in the right way. So, to sum up, can family firms be a force for good? I mean, the good side of this is, yes, good family firms are extremely good. There are many good examples. The Cadbury, until they were sold to Kraft in 2010 in a hostile takeovers, the La Roche today is a fantastic company. Many of the Swiss big family firms are amazingly in the way they treat corporate climate problems. Because they use their long-term horizon, they use their values, they are loyal to wherever they produce, and to some extent wealth can be given back. But, you know, when family firms are bad, they are really bad. They destroy people, they destroy the world, they destroy a lot of things. And part of it is, of course, that there is less checks and balances for very charismatic figures. And there is this issue about, over time, it becomes an entitlement. It becomes an entitlement. And if I have to sum up this in one sentence, I would say, going back to what is super important to be a responsible capitalist as a family firm is that you focus on being responsible on how money is earned and less on how money is spent. That's probably what I would say. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage Elizabeth Pollman.
Good afternoon. I have the pleasure of discussing Morten Bennedsen's excellent presentation, Can Family Firms Be a Force for Good? I don't have a clicker, though, for slides. And his question, he put it as, can family firms be a force for good? And he says, yes, but there's challenges. Or, as a corporate lawyer and law professor like myself would say, he basically said, it depends. And I love that. It's hard to disagree. And he explains by saying, if I can paraphrase, that family firms have the potential to be change makers through long-term business strategies, value-based leadership models, philanthropy, and impact investment. But there's often a lack of checks and balances, a tendency towards global tax avoidance, and not all values are a force for good. So I agree with this. I think he brings a great clarity of insight and balanced analysis to the topic. He gives the example of Cadbury and its history of corporate social responsibility, of caring for its employees, becoming involved early in setting up fair trade programs in the chocolate production, and Adrian Cadbury's involvement in the first code of corporate governance practice. Yet there are other family enterprises, even within the same industry like chocolate, that take different approaches. So for example, what comes to my mind is Cargill, which had a big alien tort statute case about child slavery and its supply chain before the US Supreme Court last year, that I've written about in a piece called The Supreme Court and the Pro-Business Paradox. And in fact, when you think about this, and you look at this from a history of, for example, US jurisprudence and practice, family enterprises have a long history of making arguments before the US Supreme Court, trying to avoid liability from customers, employees, and others, and also to gain constitutional protections to avoid statutory and other obligations. Similarly, Morten uses a series of striking examples, really striking ones, to show companies have a range of different values, and many scandals have come out of family enterprise, such as the Sackler family's Purdue Pharma, an opioid crisis, and Parmalat and corporate fraud, and so on. So when I think about whether family enterprises are a force for good, I too think of the large diversity of different types of companies that are family enterprise and of their differences in size and values and more. And some have historically been examples of early corporate social responsibility. Others aren't particularly occupied with those questions. And even others have imposed great social costs and environmental damage. There's also geographic and cultural differences around the world, of course. So it's really difficult to speak generally of family enterprise and capture that diversity properly, I think. But I'm going to aim to step back a little bit and say a little bit more, mainly bolstering Morten's excellent points and just making a few additional observations. So first, stepping back and thinking about the social good that we've been talking about, and this word sustainability and its relevance with family enterprise. I would say, well, first, on social good, you could simply start by observing that in the world economy, family businesses are estimated to contribute more than half of GDP in a world economy sense, and 2/3 of employment. So simply by being businesses and employing people and creating some sort of economic value in the world, that is a form of social good. 42% say they engage in philanthropy. But it seems that when we have these conversations, we're talking about something beyond that, beyond the fact that they're businesses employing people, et cetera, and maybe engaged in some corporate giving. So is there a social good beyond that aspect that family enterprise could or should be creating? I think certainly they could be. Should is a more debatable question. And sometimes this gets phrased in terms of sustainability, especially these days. And some reports have observed that many family enterprises aren't prioritizing sustainability. But often when they talk about that, they don't really dig into what they mean by sustainability. Of what? The business? Of different ways of defining sustainability. For example, you could say it as the social foundation for humanity in the future within planetary boundaries. Beate Schofel often says it in a form like this. And if you look at that question, There's survey data, for example, from PwC did a family business survey that surveyed over 3,000 family enterprises in over 80 territories. And it found that sustainability of the business is a top priority. So if you state it as protecting the business as the most important family asset, or ensuring that it stays in the family, or creates a legacy, or provides money for the family, that is a big top priority. But if you ask more generally about sustainability, what we might call sustainability, that is much less of a priority for most family enterprise. Instead, most family enterprises report being concerned with their expansion or diversification, digitizing, evolving new products and new thinking, et cetera, before they ever get to sustainability. And you can look at this in different ways. The green at the bottom, the small bits are the bits about prioritizing sustainability. And if you look at this survey research on family enterprise, it just doesn't scream change makers. If Morten's question was about, are they change makers? Can they be a force for social good? It seems that there's a complicated story here. So 55% say they want to lead the way. 36% were unlikely to lead, but will play our part when it's required. And then if you look at delivering benefits for the planet and human society, 53% say we need to lead the way. These are people that are thinking in the direction of being these change makers. And 30% say it's the role of government to lead the way. So I think this is to be expected when you think about almost any category of business, that there is a great diversity of views. But it is noticeable that there's a significant portion that either want to or think they need to lead the way as family enterprise. But when you look at what they're actually doing, only 37% on average have actually a sustainability strategy in place. So there's a gap between what people think they want to do or think they are required to do and what they're doing, and a great diversity of views. So there is a huge potential, and Morten really emphasizes this, that you can think about this either in terms of the size and economic impact or the types of industries that family enterprise play an important role in. So in terms of size, according to 2021 EY and University of St. Gallen Family Business Index, together, family enterprise constitutes the third largest economic contribution in the world by revenue after the United States and China. So economically, family enterprise is huge. It's very important. And when you look at industries that have particular implications for the environment or social issues like human rights, you see family enterprise is especially important in those sorts of industries. So it's very important, actually, to think about this through the family enterprise lens because of the potential. Also here in Milan, I find myself thinking about, in family enterprise, I think about a great article that was written by a professor, Lynn Stout, that was called "The Corporation as Time Machine: Intergenerational Equity, Intergenerational Efficiency, and the Corporate Form." And she argued, it's a really neat article, that argues that the corporation itself as a form is like a time machine that has this amazing ability as legal technology for transferring wealth forward and sometimes even backwards in time for the benefit of present and future generations. That's not just family enterprise. All corporations have that kind of quality to them potentially. And she pointed out that preserving resources and pursuing long-term projects for future generations were exactly what some of the earliest corporations were doing. Townships, universities, monasteries, and it was a corporate entity, the Veneranda Fabbrica del Duomo di Milano, that began building the Duomo, and it was a project that spanned 30 human generations through the corporate form. So when you think about how corporations contribute to social welfare, there's no reason that we have to consider only the welfare of the people alive. And as Morten points out, family enterprise in some ways is very well situated to engage in this kind of long-term strategy across multiple generations. And even if you're thinking, well, some family enterprises, as we see from the data and as we know from the real world, some family enterprises don't want to be these change makers. They have a different view. There's a wide range of views on these terms, ESG, sustainability, CSR. These are things that we may not agree with. we may not agree about what constitutes the social good or what should be emphasized. But even if that is the view, when I started thinking about this, the world is changing in a very interesting way that when the term ESG started to come about 20 years ago, it started with the United Nations, members of the financial industry, and institutional investors. And it has spread, and it has put pressure on public companies, and it even reaches private companies in various ways. So even if there was a family enterprise that was private, not aiming to be a change maker, they would still be affected by these trends, potentially. And some would be catalyzed to take into consideration the ESG and sustainability trends. Because research suggests that regardless of the industry, a better CSR performance by a family business has stronger effect on brand value than for non-family businesses. So it's of particular importance. ESG and sustainability are increasingly important factors in business partnerships and procurement decisions. So if you're a private company that's supplying public companies, and these public companies now have ESG obligations and disclosures that they have to make, now the pressure is going on to the private supplier in ways that they might not have anticipated. Also, for various government contracts, these sorts of issues start to be considerations in whether the government will use particular firms as suppliers and so on. Sometimes the companies aren't looking for true outcomes as far as ESG at this point. It may simply be evidence of a strategy, but it flows down and it creates a system in which there's great connections between companies and their obligations. It's also increasingly important to attract and retain employees and to connect with customers. There's many different studies that show this, especially to millennials and Gen Z, et cetera. Lenders and insurers are increasingly incorporating ESG into their policies. And the regulation regarding this is increasingly relevant for public and private companies. Many different obligations are being passed in different ways that cut across categories. So sometimes it's by the size, not with regard to whether it's a listed or not listed company, et cetera. So I think there's a very interesting connection that's happening between public and private company ecosystems in this space, in which even for companies that don't want to be change makers, they will have to start following some of these things, and they'll find that there's pressures to change. So I'll conclude with a few thoughts on key areas for focus. I think where the conversation is going with these trends is that we're seeing that integrating ESG or sustainability into the business model and operations and governance is what is being focused on, not just separate philanthropy, and especially not with aggressive tax avoidance. So this is looking at, as Morten was ending with, and as Colin was starting with today, how the company is making the products or services, how it's making its money, and integrating ESG or sustainability considerations into all aspects of what it's doing with that regard. And it's not just looking at the kind of check-the-box things, but the conversation is also moving towards looking at the authenticity of the efforts, so that it's not viewed as ancillary, but as fundamental to furthering the company's mission or purpose. Now, this isn't me espousing what I think should happen. I am actually just making an observation that this is where the conversation is going with the trends. So this is whether or not the company is prioritizing these things, their business partners, their customers, their employees, the governments that regulate them are moving in this direction. So these are the things that we'll have to be focused on. Compliance in a changing world. There's so much to keep on top of as far as new obligations, disclosure, and otherwise, and how they might affect family enterprise and compliance with that. And then finally, a need for regulation and enforcement. This is a broader point that there will be some aspects of family enterprise that doesn't get reached, in a sense, by the existing obligations that we have. And so there are many people working on new efforts at regulation and enforcement that will likely impact family enterprise. So another space, besides complying with the existing obligations, to look for is what is likely to be coming. So it's integrating it into the business model, the authenticity of the efforts, complying with the changes, and also thinking about additional regulation and enforcement that's coming. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage the moderator of Session 3, Family Enterprise, Marco Ventoruzzo, together with panel participants Matteo Liberali, Andrea Munari, and Roberto Cravero.
Good afternoon. Let me very briefly frame the issue and also introduce our panelists this afternoon. Why at a conference that talks about the evolution of capitalism, where we started in the morning from corporate purpose, we end up with family firms? Now, of course, they represent, as we have seen, roughly half of the business activity in the world. It's definitely the prevailing model. In a way, you might argue that any time there is an individual that controls directly or indirectly a business, it is a family firm. So obviously, we cannot have that discussion without taking into account family firms. But also, there is, I think, this, at least for me, somehow vague and blurred idea that they do have a special relationship with some of the issues that are at the core of our discussion today: sustainability, long-termism, stakeholders, for, on the one hand, somehow intuitive reasons, but also reasons that are hard to pinpoint. And so I'm a jurist, I'm a lawyer, and as we move to the questions which have much more to do with, I would say, the real life of these kind of enterprises, I cannot resist mentioning a couple of things that are somehow more law-related. The first one, which is not trivial, especially if we are thinking about some kind of regulation, some kind, let it be self-regulation, let it be mandatory rules, is the definition. Morten, in his introductory talk, has pointed out briefly how there is in the economic business literature, there are ways to define, of course, family businesses, but it's hard to say what are the features of a family business. And that, however, is essential to the extent that that variable comes into play also in the legal discourse. The second thing which is connected is that while business people, entrepreneurs, practitioners are very interested in the actual problems of family businesses, jurists, at least at a more theoretical level, are hesitant. And jurists, I mean both, lawyers, but also regulators, to formally incorporate them and distinguish them. In many ways, the approach tends to be more neutral. Apart from the big distinction between closely held and publicly held, there is not really any set of rules that specifically deals. There are patches of things here and there. You take into account family links to define independent directors, but there's not a coherent, systematic approach. This might be wise, in a way, might be right to be neutral, but I think it's a thing that might be partially at least challenged. And then the very last point, which I also think emerged in the discussion before, is that at the end of the day, probably a family structure, meaning ownership, involvement in the business and so forth, in my view, I think in our view, is somehow a multiplier of what lays beneath, for good and for bad. It's a sort of catalyst of features, impacts, procedures, and so what is good might turn excellent, and what is bad might become a nightmare. No? So on those basis, our panelists today are Matteo Liberali from Luve. He's the CEO, a very successful family-owned business. And I have, as I told him, coined a new catchphrase for the company that I'm willing to sell you, which is a company that keeps us cool today without making us hotter tomorrow, right? Good. And then we have Andrea Munari, so the perspective of a banker. And in fact, Andrea was the first CEO that I actually saw in action in real life, because he was the CEO of Banca Cabotto the very first time 20 years ago, roughly 20 years ago, when I became independent director of a corporation, of a bank. Finally, we have Roberto Cravero, who is a practitioner, he's a consultant, and also represents the Italian Association of Independent Directors, NED community. So let me move quickly to a couple of questions that we have discussed. Since they bring together some fairly different perspectives, my first question is truly obvious and very broad and probably generic, but I'm sure their answers will not be generic, which is, especially in the Italian context, what are, based on your real experience, the pros and cons of an ownership structure in which one family has control and is actively involved in the managing of the business? And maybe we start with Andrea.
Well, I would say, as a joke, in 1 second, family-owned business don't like to pay investment banking fees. So normally they are extremely reluctant. But apart from kidding, first of all, I believe it, particularly if we look at the Italian situation, which is what you are implying, I would say that 2008, 2012 has been a watershed for the Italian governance, corporate governance, the structure of family-owned companies and small and mid companies, which represent nearly 95% of Italian economy at the end of the day. And the reason was that I think that what we experienced was a perfect storm, and they were virtually abandoned by banks, who in the past have been very generous in lending to them a lot of money, but they found themselves extremely leveraged. So from then on, I would say that the results have been remarkable. And even myself, which by formation I've always been looking at large firms, particularly in the last part of my career, which is has been CEO of a commercial bank, BNL and BNP, I start looking myself what there is behind this. And the first thing that you notice is that these companies, at least to me, are no more distincted by family structure, governance, is that are they competitive or non-competitive? Because at the end of the day, these companies, particularly these even small companies, are looking to be sustainable in the long run, to be in the market in the long run. And I couldn't agree more with Mary in the last comments she made, when in fact, the fact that do they need to be sustainable is by definition they have to, otherwise they're out of the market. That is exactly what is happening today. And I think that Italian companies in particular have been able to compete very well. And I give you some numbers which are mostly the reason why I start looking at it. If you look at the current account of Italy, basically was negative in 2012 by something like 18 to 22% of the Italian GDP. So an enormous debt that the economy has created vis-à-vis the rest of the world. Today, we are creditor of the world by 6-7%. And if you look at the composition of this has been done mostly by companies with less than 250 people, which is exactly the opposite of what is happening in France, for example. So there is no doubt that this company made a tremendous effort in the last few years. So to an extent where today, I think that for them and for us as lender, we are trying to figure out what do they need next, what do they want to go, because it's not easy for a lender in particular, for a bank, to really be able to serve these companies. Actually, I would say that for a bank, assist a small bank, a family-owned bank, family-owned business is an authentic nightmare. But companies have realized that. And I think that what I've seen in the last few years, particularly is that the governance has changed. We ourselves are inviting them to change their board structure, to include more independent director and so on. And it has been taken, I would say, with a reasonable acceptance, degree of acceptance, because they recognize that the only way they can attract interest by lender and by, let's say, capital market is really doing this thing. So I think that these companies are actually pretty innovative. And I would say that going forward, I don't know if we have to talk now, I see what is lying ahead and what is really the problem going. The first one, talking about Italy in particular, this is a very, very old, it's an old population. And when there is old people, the average age of people is rising, as unfortunately we have in this country, the ability to innovate is remarkably, goes down. There is no doubt about that. People don't like to take risks when they are old. And this company, on the contrary, want to take risks. So what I see is that even on the management side, there is an ability of this company to finally bring in people with different expertise and professionalism. Is all good? Yes. But I think that going forward, we will have this problem rising and rising. And what I believe are the major issue are mostly, I would say, two. One is that, has been mentioned today several times, we desperately need a capital market union. There is no way companies, particularly small companies, mid companies, can go through the stock exchange. Actually, I shouldn't say this. As a banker, when I meet a company who wants to go to the stock, want to list in the stock exchange, I say, why do you want to do this? It's an authentic, no, I know that I'm saying something, but this is an authentic nightmare. It's a nightmare. Why do you want to do this? Today, Mr. Ferrari mentioned this. You know, he gave a number, but why do you want to do this? No, and unfortunately, that is one of the major issues I see going forward. Banks have difficulty in doing this. The second one is that I believe, at least, that the next challenge for all the companies, notwithstanding dimension, structure, ownership, and so on, is will they be able to create and to accumulate digital capital? Because at the end of the day, for digital capital, it's not only buying software, hardware, and so on. It's really making sure that you're able to utilize this technology in an efficient way. And we need people to do this. So today, when I heard, probably it was in the beginning, I said, well, we have difficulties in hiring people with certain skill and so on. This is across the board. And I do believe that this represents an Achilles heel for the Italian economy and also for European economy. So we really need to incentivize people. One thing, and I stop with this comment, is that I personally ask every time what is the average salary of an employee in a company. And what I notice is that in Italy in particular, we pay too low people. And so a lot of people, a lot of graduates basically emigrate. We need to take risk on young people. We need to really change this sort of model because, to be fair, one of the major vector of competitivity in Italy has been the very low cost of labor, but this is unsustainable in this world. Companies, small companies, family companies, are aware of this.
Thank you. Roberto, Mr. Cravero, pros and cons in your experience.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to express to all of you the regrets of Maria Pierdicchi not to be here today, because she was supposed to be here in my place. Unfortunately, due to personal reasons, she's not able to say. Well, when we are talking about family business, of course, we are talking about a business which is strictly connected with the family. The family could have significant state or the control, but in any case there is a connection. For people who are not aware of what we are talking about, it could seem that talking about family business, we're talking about non-relevant business or something which could be insignificant. We have seen, and we all have the information, that this is exactly the opposite. So we do have a strong contributions of GDP, of employment rate, and I would say also on key drivers for transformations toward a sustainable world by company who are family business. In Italy, if we go to a survey that has been made by IDAF Observatory, we have something that is roughly 85% of the global. So we have a huge percentage of business which is family business. And we do have something like 70% of the employment rate which is connected to family business. So it's very sensitive and relevant. I would start with a quote which comes from a book which is the Family Business Handbook that has been published last year, which is, how can I say, which represents what we said today, that says that family and business are two of the most powerful forces in the world, but when combined, they amplify their impact and their complexity. And again, it is said that family business can represent the best or the worst form of capitalism. So the question you pose is essential, because we honestly have to go a little deeper in what are the pros and what are the cons of the family business. We already had an important session, and the professor has already expressed us some of the concepts. I agree on the fact that probably going in the cons, one of the most important cons that we have is the long-term view and the long-term strategy. This has been said also this morning by the chair of Borsa, and I do agree on the fact that this has an important effect on family business. Why? Because they invest in long term. They have the ability to invest in community, in team working, in growing together, and this has important effects on what they have. And probably as a consequence, we have a long-lasting, something has already been said also on this. You know that there has been recently a study published by Bocconi and Russell Reynolds that goes to, the name of the survey was Learning and Practicing Longevity. This study goes through 10 cases, 10 family business. The oldest one was Wendell in 1701, and the latest was Porsche in 1931. And gives some roots on what is the value and what are the pros of the family business. By the way, just for information, you know that there is associations of family business. I've had the possibility to deal with some of them, which is called Les Enochiens. You can be part of it if you have been own the business for at least 200 years. But if you are still managing, I mean, if a family descendant is still managing the company. Well, it seems to me that the longest story, the longest lived company is a company that has been founded in Japan in the 18th century. That is a small hotel in Tokyo, but it has been owned and managed by the same family for 1,300 years. So this is something that is quite amazing to know how they can reach this point. But if you go a little farther, you know always that the 3% of the family-owned business can survive the 4th generation. So this means that we do have, as it has already been said, there's a strong difference between having the possibility to apply what are the pros or going to the cons. What are the cons? Of course, even on this, something has already been said, but I think that one of the relevant point is the complexity. We do have someone talk about the hidden pyramid, saying that what happens that in a company you do have a CEO, you have the management, and we have the employees, and this is how flows the power. I mean, in the family business, very often it happens that you have another pyramid on top with the owners, so the family, and then the board, and then the CEO. So this means that you do have a relevant influence. And this, of course, drives to more complexity. And you need to have the possibility, and this is another weakness, of having a breakdown of communication and trust that very often drives you to conflicts that could be very tough and very often could destroy a relevant wealthy in the family. Last, and this probably is something that is more typical in Italy, is, as already been said, the difficulty in succession plan. Why? Because in the same survey I mentioned before, you read that the 66% of the family business in Italy is run by family members, while, for example, in France is the 26%, while in the UK is the 10%. So this means that when you do have to put in place a succession plan, you need to do something that is not easy. So what could be the conclusion? I would say that there are 3 points to try to mitigate the risks. And I think that we could have the importance of having an effective framework in family governance, in wealth governance, and in corporate governance. Of course, Ned is focused on the last one, and as we know what the G20 or ACD principle of corporate governance define, knowing that the purpose of corporate governance is to build an environment of trust, transparency, and accountability necessary for fostering long-term investment, financial stability, and business integrity. So this could probably help company in going, but probably on this we will turn in a second. Thank you.
No, thank you. You all know that in genetics, geneticists use fruit flies for their studies and experiments. So now we have heard about different theories, but if we were at the conference on genetics, it's a little bit like if from the Petri dish, the fruit fly would start flying up and say, let me explain how it looks from my perspective. So, Mr. Liberali, you are the fruit fly that we have been talking about, and maybe you can tell us from your point of view, what are your very actual, real experience, what are the challenges and pros and cons of having your family, which I believe I see also here in the audience, involved in the business.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I have to say that probably my intervention today is totally useless after Professor Bennedsen, because he explained almost everything about the good points of family business. Of course, if we talk about Italy, the average size of the family companies is much smaller than the one we were talking before, we've been presented before. I would say that, in my opinion, there is one distinctive feature of a family company, no matter the size, is the fact that, or at least in our case, is the passion, which is written also in our logo. Because the entrepreneur or the family who owns the business has a special affection to the business itself, has a special passion, so is driven by this passion, the will to succeed, the will to get results, to leave a print or a marker somehow in the history, even in small companies. And yeah, I think this is one very distinctive feature, in my opinion. Of course, then this means that together with passion is not enough. You have to have a vision, or you have to be a visionary, because normally we see in Italy, at least, most of the entrepreneurs have been successful because they had some brilliant ideas about innovation. They invented something, or they invented a process, or they've been very creative. So to be creative with a vision in advance compared to somebody else, to have the idea before somebody else, and to try to grow it, to cultivate this vision in order to make it successful. And of course, the other part is continuity, which was mentioned before. But today I learned something, because I was used to know that there is a well-known joke about the fact that normally the first generation build a business, the second one grow it, and the third one destroy. So today this presentation convinced me that there are much longer histories than that. I was working to speed up the process as a second generation to destroy it, but I've not succeeded yet, but I will try. But apart from that, I think that the vision of the continuity means that you have a vision, you want to leave a print, as I said before, and this means that there is a different level of bravery when it has to, we're talking about capex or investment in R&D or in new products or innovation, because innovation by definition is not 100% successful. There are goods and bads that are successful, and those who doesn't work. And we experience as well some being very innovative, which has always been a distinctive feature of Louvre Group. We had a lot of innovation extremely successful, and we had some of them who didn't work. Maybe we were too early in bringing these things on the market. But I think that the pro of a family-owned business as well, in my case, in that case I'm talking about Louvre, is the fact that we pioneered what today is very well known. So ESG principles we applied, maybe without being aware that we can call them ESG, many years ago. Because if I think about, and I will start from the social part, yes. The social part, my father was the founder of the company. My grandfather was a blue-collar worker in a foundry. And my father went to the university thanks to the scholarship paid by the company where my grandfather was working. So the first thing that we launched, once we reached a certain size, was to repeat exactly the same scheme, to give the chance to the sons and daughters of our people to study. And so this is very common in Italy, to have a paternalistic approach, no? to try to be generous, to giving loans to our people, not without interest rates, of course, we're not a bank, for their needs, whether buying houses or getting married and things like that. And trying also to be to cooperate with the territory, which means it's mutual interest to get the best student, to get the best student from the high school, the university, and so on, and also to this approach of trying to be socialist, proven in the last recent years. During the COVID times, we had a special funding for hospitals and things like that, and recently, and this it's just appeared on the press in the last few days, we decided in this troubled time for this, due to the energy bills and so on, we put 3 million, the board decided to put 3 million available for our people to have a special bonus to pay the energy bills and so on. So talking about the environmental, we introduced the A, B, C energy certification from the domestic appliance business. We introduced it in 92, in in 1992 on our product range, which was the big driver of our new project is less raw material, more gray material, and less energy consumption, less refrigerant charge in order to reduce the GWP of our product. We were the first to invest in natural refrigerants, laboratory R&D, well in advance compared to anybody else. This is not just because you are innovative or just because you are taking care of the community and so on. It's also a matter of an obligation. Because if you want to succeed, you have to be visionary, you have to see before what is going to happen. Then if we talk about governance, I think I'm the wrong, probably, testimonial, because Louvre has never been the typical Italian family-owned company where there is a board of directors made by the whole family and with the family owning 100% of the shares. In our history, since 1986, we've been 100% owner of the company just for 5 days for technical reasons, because at the beginning, the Louvre means lucky venture. At the beginning, were 3 venture capital companies back in 1986. So, which means that at that time, the board was already, in the board were represented each of the 3 venture capital companies. There were independent board members. There was an internal audit named by venture capital companies. So, the history is a bit different. If we go to the, maybe I'm getting too long because you're looking at me.
No, actually, let me stay with you for a second round. We go in reverse order. And so let me stay with you and let's maybe shift to something slightly more technical. Because here, where we are, and many of us are actually actively engaged in different capacities in trying to make going public and being listed more attractive, simplifying. We all feel some kind of competitive pressure from other European countries. So in your own experience, having seen the whole process of going public, what is your takeaway lesson? Would you do it again? What could be improved? What were the difficulties? Was any of the complexity, if you met, if any, somehow related to the ownership structure of the corporation or not?
If you ask me if I would do it again, I say yes. Maybe I would like to change something. But
like what? What?
If you allow me, let me go back to one thing about the cons. Is the fact that the succession issue could be an issue. In our case, we are the second generation. The problem is in my opinion, the difference is if you consider, the family consider itself to serve the company or the company to serve the family. This makes, in my opinion, the big difference among serious companies, serious family companies, and those are not serious because we present some bad cases before. And an example of this is that when we went public, it was not in the plan yet. And it was, we went public through a SPAC at that time, back in 2015. And at the time, the family decided, we decided, there are 2 families in our company. We had an internal discussion, and then we decided, even if we are not, if it was not planned, even if probably we are not 100% ready, we have to catch the train, because you have to catch the train when it's there. So we decided to do it, and somehow it was a foolish decision. But on the other hand, it was very interesting, because to go public through a SPAC was a bit more complicated, because they tell you it's easier. It's not that. Because at that time, we were the second SPAC in Italy, so there were no jurisprudence on that. So the legal part concerning the contract between us and the promoters was already complicated. Then all the informative prospectus for the AAM was difficult. Then when we have to move from AAM to the main market, we have to make twice the activity. So it's the paradise for lawyers, for advisors, and you are a lawyer because you're lying. You're laughing. Oh, you're an advisor. So it's a paradise for them. They earn a lot of money. They charge you a lot of hours and bills. But the most disturbing thing, if we start from the bad side, is the fact that the impression, I'm used to work, and to have to deal with people whose main concern is to protect their own shoulder, let's say politely, somehow is disturbing. It's frustrating. I want to make things, and I don't want, and somebody said, no, but we have to ask the opinion to this one, to the other one, because we want to be on the safe side. Everybody wants to be on the safe side, apart me. No? So this is the bad part, and then even now that we just announced that we've been admitted to the STAR segment starting from 21st of September. Even if it's just a letter is complicated. And even in this case, this morning I heard we were talking about majority votes.
Shares.
Majority shares. Even in this case, it was not clear from us, at least to me, it was not clear from the beginning that in order to be admitted to the STAR segment, you have to have a floating percentage, which is not related to the shares, but to the voting rights. So we had to change the process once more. But having said that about the negative part, I would do it again and again and again. Because the first thing, it helps you to enlarge your vision. No? Maybe as a family manufacturing company, you are too focused on the product, on the manufacturing process, and then you have to have a larger vision. And this larger vision comes during the process or while meeting investors. So I learned a lot during this process by confronting opinion with people who has a completely different mindset and a completely different vision of looking my group from outside. And this is a very important learning part. It obliges you to reconsider, so the way you do your business. And the paradox is that normally you say that the listed company, they have a short-term vision, the quarter or the semester and so on. It is true for the shareholder, the investors, but in reality, you are obliged to make more strategic thinking in order to grant the value in the long term. And this is a different approach. And then, of course, it's on the personal point of view, also on the company point of view, there is much more self-confidence. You gain credibility. You are invited in an event like this. I would never have been invited being a countryman from Pavia. You become more attractive for the managers and also for younger people. You become more attractive for the banks. And credibility is important also in our case when we made acquisition. The biggest acquisition we made 5 years ago, 3 years ago. We made too many, so I made confusion. We were 300 million euro revenues. We were buying 100 million euro revenue business, and the credibility for the seller, which was a multinational company, was the fact that we were quoted, audited, serious company, financially strong enough. So this is a big advantage. The last thing, the bad thing, is sometimes the board you have to deal to many things which are compliance, and it's not clear sometimes who is doing what. There is the ODV, the internal auditing, the external auditor. So there are many people asking the same question on the same areas, and that's it. I would say.
The one thing I would say it's positive is that my sense is that in this very last, I would say, few months, maybe 1 year, there has finally been a growing consensus, not only among the business community, practitioners, but also among regulators, supervisors, the government, that something needs to be done to make the system more, without lowering protections for investors, but to make the the system more competitive. And if you want to take a small sign, but probably a step in that direction, or very recently, just a couple of days ago, new concept rules came out to simplify somehow the preparation of the registration statement and the prospectus. A little sign, but something. The other large variable is corporate governance, and so let me go back to Mr. Cravero, who is working, I think, also on one of these voluntary set of principles, codes, call it however you want, specifically for SMEs and family-owned corporation. So in your perspective, one size does not fit all might be particularly true for family businesses, but what can you tell us about some principles, ideas, rules that in that context, on a voluntary basis, can in fact be particularly important, at least to discuss for family businesses?
Well, thank you. Well, after these considerations that you made, and I appreciate the substance, the genuinity, and the passion also that comes from. You see, and you have the perceptions on how difficult it is for some companies to face the listing. You know that someone is moving back. So that's why we focus on unlisted company, and that's why we focus on corporate governance of unlisted company. The difficulties that has been expressed today is connected to the strong system that, of course, create a sort of high pressures on listed company for compliance, for audit, and this is something that creates also a sort of neglected area for unlisted company. I mean, when we have to discuss on this, this problem drives companies who are not obliged to talk, to get into considerations the relevance of corporate governance, because to consider this as a sort of neglected area. As you said, we had the opportunity at European level, because we think that the European is important, trying to go into a sort of general standard rules applicable all over Europe, and with ECODA, which is the associations of the national associations of independent directors, I took part of a working group where the scope was exactly the revisiting of the principle of corporate governance for unlisted company. The starting point was exactly how do we have to consider? Do we have to think of some that has to be mandatory, or do we have to think of some that has to be voluntary? And do we have to, in this case, introduce a sort of comply or explain rule, or do we have to let it as it is? And finally, we got to this decision that it has to be not mandatory, it has to be voluntary, also has been said before in some speeches, but the point is that this is not mandatory. Why? One of the reasons is that when we are speaking about unlisted company, we are speaking about a very huge universe of people, of subjects. We are speaking, we are talking about business family, we are talking about joint ventures, we are talking about companies who are maybe owned or controlled by groups, we are talking about startups. So it's very large. And we think that the only way to increase the sensibility of the managers and of the shareholders on the importance of corporate governance principle is just give only a guidance. So express what are the principles and then goes giving some key rules. The code, which has been published last year by ECODA, is a code that has two different phases. The first one starts with 9 principles which are to be applied for all companies. And then the second one with other 5 principles which has to be applied just for bigger company or company that do have a more complex structure or company that do have significant liabilities and relationship with banks. So this, of course, something that will goes on also with the sustainability rate and with the relevance for the bank in the rating to consider how the company is, how can I say, well posed on this topic. So the topics that we have are split in two, and the document has been approved. We are then trying with Net Community and with the working group, which is, by the way, has been working on these documents to try to make a sort of national deployment of this principle, because of course the principle, the European principle are to be fitted with the national context and with the national legislations that couldn't just be kept as they are. And so the work of the working group, of Net Community is just to release this document, and this could be done probably in the next week. I think that it's very important, and also I am very happy to be here and in workshop like this in debating the value of the family business, and we would strongly enhance the possibility to discuss and to have relevant stakeholders like Borsa is, like Assonime is, like Confindustria is, or the university, to arrive to something that is commonly shared. Because we think that, as we already have been seeing, that due to the relevant contributions of this company to the GDP growth, to the employment rate growth, having the possibility to create the sensibility on management and shareholder is very important. I think that what we do have, apart from fixing principle, and I say principle because it's not a code, because a code is something more mandatory, like it is for listed company, is something that has to be defined, but the real challenge comes from the implementation. And so probably only if we, all the main stakeholder comes to an agreement and saying and endorsing this relevance for unlisted company, we could reach something that could be a great opportunity for our country.
Thank you. And let's go back to finish the perspective of a banker. And you, in fact, already told us something. But first of all, a kind of half joke, and you have already answered. As a banker, leaving fees aside, do you prefer to have a family-owned and managed business as a creditor, as a debtor, or as a client to assist in going public? And secondly, more generally, what are the peculiarities that you have seen in terms of resilience, in terms of strength, in terms of limits to growth, again, from the perspective of the financial structure and of a bank that assists businesses in their different activities?
Well, it's pretty complex. I would say this, and I am pretty convinced, of course, of this. Listing is not relevant for us in deciding if we can give credit to the company. Of course, listing normally a listed company as a setup which somehow should reassure you about certain things. To an extent that when I visit clients, say just set up as you should go to listing, but don't do it. Reality is a little bit more complex, because I think that today companies are becoming extremely innovative in general. And I go back to my initial point. Do we want to be competitive, so sustainable in the long run, or we just play for the short? And I felt in the last few years, I'm also in the board of a family-owned business. I saw a remarkable growth in terms of evolution in terms of corporate governance. And I feel that going forward, these companies are the ones who are going to succeed. And the banks gradually, I feel, they are less and less interested in lending to this company and so on, but to really help them to grow and eventually to have other sort of sources of financing. So I feel that from this standpoint, as I said, the governance is important. One thing personally that I look at it very always, is for how long the CEO has been in charge. Not because the CEO, the current CEO is bad. The problem is that the longer a CEO is in charge, the more riskier, or the riskier is when he finally steps down, because you don't know what will happen next. If you are not able, if you have not set up a good corporate governance. And we have seen this recently in a lot of companies, very famous companies as well. And that always, to me, is a sign that, succession planning and so on is something very important that banks should look at. Personally, I do. But this is true for every single business. So it's not the fact that, a particular CEO is good. Of course, I remember when I was working, I was really fascinated by a person who was called Robert de Guiseta. He was the CEO of Coca-Cola. Phenomenal result. He died, unfortunately. He was a heavy smoker. He died, and Coca-Cola after him had a very tough time. That we could see other companies, GE, we have seen, unfortunately, what has happened. But to me, the very important point is that even in the board, we should be able to see some sort of role in things. Not necessarily because the current one are bad and so on. On the contrary, because if I really look at the long term, they should also prepare people to run it. So that is really something that I notice is true even in my job. After 6, 7, 8 years in the same position, you start to be out. you run the company if it goes fine with a left hand, if you're right hand, because it's too easy, and you are becoming too much, I would say, self-confident. But on the contrary, this world in particular requires continuous challenge. So I repeat, it's not a critique to long-term CEOs. I cannot say because my CEO is a long-term despair. But reality is what will happen next.
Sure.
And that is, if you are a lender, in this case, if you are a shareholder, you should look at this thing.
And you want to know. So in a way, this final note, I think, confirms that family firms are, present in many ways the interesting pros and cons. Because on the one hand, you might tend to have CEOs and managers with a relatively long tenure, but on the other hand, generally speaking, you also could or should maybe have some ideas and certainties about what will happen next, and also pros and cons once again. But I think we have exceeded our time by a couple of minutes, and so thank you again to all of you, and
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.
That's
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage for the closing remarks, Marcello Bianchi.
On behalf of the organizers of this conference, Assonime, ECGI, and Bocconi University, I wish to thank firstly Borsa Italiana for hosting and supporting this event. Our presence in this prestigious building in what used to be the trading room is more than just a symbol. As Luca Garavoglia underlined this morning, capital markets can play a key role in supporting the evolution of companies and investors toward a stronger responsibility on environmental and social issues. Shareholders and stakeholders are not necessarily conflicting agents, but potential partners once we adopt a long-term perspective of value creation where both the economic and the social dimension can converge. This perspective dominated today's discussions, animated by inspiring academic presentation and passionate concrete experiences. The dialogue between innovative thinking and evolutionary practices is at the basis of this event and will continue to guide cooperation between companies Assonime represents and the prestigious academic institutions. We all received a lot of food for thought on the general theme of the conference, how enterprises can be responsible, and on the specific topics on which focused the three sessions, where different tools for supporting long terms have been analyzed. The first tool, the company purpose, according to Colin Meyer copyright, can be defined as self-imposed commitment of the enterprise on its contribution to social value. A commitment whose legal strength can vary from the adoption of a benefit company status to the inclusion of purpose in the bylaws, to the weaker but not less important inclusion of sustainability in companies' policies and strategies. In any case, in this perspective, shareholders and management, both current and future ones, are linked to this commitment. The second tool analyzed, less explicitly linked to commitment, is the empowerment of controlling owner through unequal voting right mechanisms, so to allow to overcome possible market short-termism and financial constraints to long-term and responsible strategies. The third tool considered is of sociological nature, the pervasive and persistent role of family enterprises, where their structural orientation to long-term and even intergenerational horizon can meet a parallel need of our economy. In all those areas, there are opportunities and risks, costs and benefits that should be adequately addressed by all agents and be put in a balanced and smart regulatory framework. A framework which is currently under revision, in particular in Europe, but also in the US. Everywhere, expectations about a capitalism revisited are increasing. In this evolution, we need not only more responsible enterprises and investors, but also responsible policymakers in order to make sustainability actually sustainable. To this goal can require to make difficult choices, where the increasing number of public goods can find a different balance. I think that many input in this direction have been provided explicitly or implicitly in this conference, and this can be an issue to be addressed in a future one. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a true pleasure hosting you here at Borsa Italiana on day one of Capitalism Revisited. Please do not forget any personal belongings, as day two will be held at Bocconi University in a different venue. We thank you for being with us today and hope to see you again very soon. Arrivederci.